Have you ever believed that birds abandon their chicks if touched by humans? Or perhaps you've heard that birds sing because they are happy? Well, you're not alone. Many of us have grown up with these myths about our feathered friends. Today we bust these myths wide open. Let's talk about the first myth, the notion that birds abandon their chicks if touched by humans. It's a common belief, but guess what? It's a myth. Contrary to popular belief, many bird species have a rather poor sense of smell. So, they're not going to detect that human scent and reject their chicks. This misconception likely stems from our own human fears of contamination or rejection. But in the bird world, it's a different story. Parents are not going to abandon their chicks solely because of human contact. Of course, it's still best to leave nesting birds undisturbed whenever possible, to allow nature to take its course. Now let's move on to the second myth, that birds sing because they are happy. It's a pleasant thought, isn't it? The idea that the morning bird song is a chorus of joy, but the truth is a bit more practical and less romantic. Birds primarily sing for purposes such as territory defense, attracting mates, and communicating with other birds. Every chirp, tweet, and warble has a meaning in the bird language. It's their way of saying, "This is my space, stay away," or "Hey, look at me, I'm a great catch." So, while bird songs might sound joyous to our ears, they're more about survival and propagation of the species. In debunking these myths, we uncover a world that's far more fascinating than the tales we've been told. Birds are complex creatures with behaviors driven more by survival than sentimentality. So, the next time you hear a bird singing, remember that it's not necessarily because they're happy. And if you stumble upon a baby bird, don't worry about touching it, as the parents are unlikely to abandon it. Welcome back! Let's continue debunking some popular bird myths. Have you ever heard that birds migrate by hitching rides on the backs of larger birds? Or that feeding birds bread is beneficial for them? Let's find out the truth. First up, the myth about birds migrating by hitching rides on the backs of larger birds. It's a whimsical thought, isn't it? A tiny sparrow cruising on the back of a majestic eagle, taking in the sights as they journey south for the winter. But alas, this is simply not the case. While some bird species may occasionally flock together during migration, there is absolutely no evidence to support the idea that smaller birds hitch rides on the backs of larger birds for long-distance migration. Each bird must flap its own wings and make the journey on its own. Now let's turn our attention to the belief that feeding birds bread is beneficial. It's a common sight in parks and gardens, people tossing breadcrumbs to birds. But did you know that this seemingly harmless act can actually be detrimental to our feathered friends? Feeding birds bread, particularly white bread, can be harmful to their health. Bread lacks the necessary nutrients for birds and can lead to malnutrition and other health problems. Birds need a balanced diet, just like us, and bread just doesn't cut it. It's like us living on candy. It might taste good, but it's not going to keep us healthy. And it's not just the birds that suffer. Bread can also pollute waterways and attract pests. Uneaten bread can rot, causing algae blooms that can kill fish and other aquatic life. It can also attract rats and other unwanted pests. So what can you feed birds instead? Seeds, fruits, or even bird feed are much better options. These provide the nutrients birds need and won't harm the environment. So remember, it's better to give birds seeds, fruits, or even bird feed instead of bread, and no, they don't need a lift from larger birds to migrate. Continuing with our myth-busting journey, let's look at another common myth. Birds avoid flying in the rain because they will get wet and cold. Also, do birds migrate south for the winter to escape the cold? Let's find out. You might think it's a no-brainer that birds would shun the rain. After all, who wants to get wet and cold? But here's the thing, many birds are perfectly capable of flying in wet conditions. Their feathers aren't just for show, you know, they are designed to repel water, keeping our feathered friends dry even in the midst of a downpour. This water repellence enables them to maintain their body temperature, foiling the elements with their natural, built-in raincoat. So while some birds might take shelter during a heavy storm, it's not because they can't handle a bit of water. Now let's talk about those snowbirds. It's a widely held belief that birds migrate south for the winter to escape the cold. But is that the whole truth? Not quite. While it's true that many bird species do migrate south during the winter months, it's not just about the temperature. Migration patterns are influenced by a variety of factors. Food availability is a big one. Birds need to eat, and if their food source disappears when the snow falls, they'll need to go where the grub is. Daylight hours also play a part. Some birds need a certain amount of sunlight each day, and if winter in their current location doesn't provide that, they'll fly off to somewhere that does. And let's not forget about breeding cycles. Some birds migrate to specific areas to breed, And it just so happens that those areas are in the south. So while the cold might play a part, it's not the only reason birds pack their bags and head south for the winter. So, the next time you see a bird flying in the rain, remember they're not necessarily cold or wet, and their migration is more about survival and less about escaping the cold.